Okay, so here's Black Like Me, a novel written by John Howard Griffin, published in 1961, detailing his journey living as a white man, disguised as a Negro, as they say in the book. Um, he lived for about a month in the Southern America, and he detailed his experience. Now, it's a dated, it is dated at times. It is a product of its time, and what I mean by that is he certainly was writing for an audience from the 50s, and he was certainly trying his best to get his message across. And there are times where he uses some cringy type turns, but you'll see what I mean. So here we go. Preface. And one day in the book Black Like Me, published in 1961, the journey of a white man through the South of America, living as a Negro. Preface. This may not be all of it. It may not cover all of the questions, but it is what it is like to be a Negro in a land where we keep the Negro down. Some whites will say this is not really it. They will say this is the white man's experience as a Negro in the South, not the Negroes. But this is pecunish, meaning of little importance. And we no longer have time for that. We no longer have time to atomize principles and beg the question. We fill too many gutters while we argue unimportant points and confuse issues. The Negro, the South, these are the details. We read the story. The real story is the universal one of men who destroy the souls and bodies of other men. I looked away. I really kind of ruined that. All right, so I don't like that. But I'm going to make multiple mistakes, so we just have to carry on. So again, this is the preface. And he says, the Negro, the South, this is the details. The real story is the universal one of men who destroy the souls and bodies of other men, and in the process destroy themselves, for reasons neither really understand. It is a story of the persecuted, the defrauded, the feared, and the detested. I could have been a Jew in Germany, a Mexican in a number of the states, or a member of any inferior group. Only the details would have differed. The story would be the same. This began as a scientific research study of the Negro in the South, with careful compilation of data for analysis. But I filed that data and here published the journal of my own experience living as a Negro. I offer it in all its crudity and rawness. It traces the changes that occur to heart and body and intelligence when the so-called first-class citizen is cast on the junk heap of second-class citizenship. Again, I said he has a way with words, but at times it tends to be a little much. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to jump. He spends quite a while trying to darken himself up and dealing with his doctor. And the reason why we got to this point is I was talking with my wife about the book. And what I had mentioned was how shocking it was that he had to convince his doctor, obviously, to allow him this danger of taking the pills and darkening his skin and what have you, and what it might cause and what he might suffer, side effects and such. But then in the end, the doctor was actually more concerned about what he might encounter living as a black man in the South. So here we are, one day in the life of John Howard Griffin. Actually, in this case, it's his last visit to the doctor, and it's his first day living as a Negro. So here's Black Like Me, written by John Howard Griffin, November 7th. I had my last visit with the doctor in the morning. The treatment had not worked as rapidly or as completely as we had hoped, but I had a dark undercoating of pigment which I could touch up perfectly with stain. We decided I must shave my head since I had no curl. The dosage was established, and the darkness would increase as time passed. From there, I was on my own. The doctor showed much doubt and perhaps regret that he had ever cooperated with me in this transformation. Again, he gave me many firm warnings and told me to get in touch with him at any time of the day or night if I got into trouble. As I left his office, he shook my hand and said gravely, "Now you go into oblivion. Now you go into oblivion." That's beautiful, right? A cold spell had hit New Orleans, so that lying under the lamp that day was a comfortable experience. I decided to shave my head that evening and begin my journey. Right? Very apropos, kind of like nuns shaving their heads when they begin a renouncement. He's renouncing his whiteness. You'll see what I mean by that. He really did make it very ritualized. But again, he's using this to teach, to open the mind, right? To transform ignorance into wisdom, right? In the afternoon, my host looked at me with friendly alarm. "I don't know what you're up to," he said, "but I'm worried." I told him not to be, suggested I would probably leave sometime that night. He said I had a meeting, but would cancel it. I asked him not to. "I don't want you here when I go," I said. "What are you going to do, be a Puerto Rican or something?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. There may be ramifications. I'd rather you didn't know anything about it. I don't want you involved." I mean, he spoke about this somewhat, that he was worried that the people that helped him in this experiment might feel the repercussions because of, again, I mean, you're exposing a cancer in a society. It can cause a lot of trouble. Okay, so he goes on. So his host left around 5. He fixed himself a bite of supper and drank many cups of coffee, putting off the moment when he would shave his head, grind in the stain, and walk out into New Orleans night as a Negro. I go back to the book in first person. I telephoned home, but no one answered. My nerves simmered with dread. Finally, I began to cut my hair and shave my head. It took hours and many razor blades before my pot felt smooth to my hand. The house settled into silence around me. I love that. The house settled into silence around me. Occasionally, I heard the trolley car rattle past as the night grew late. I applied coat after coat of stain, wiping each coat off. Then I showered to wash off all the excess. I did not look into the mirror until I finished dressing and had packed my duffel bags. Turning off all the lights, I went into the bathroom and closed the door. I stood in darkness before the mirror, my hand on the light switch. I forced myself to flick it on. In the flood of light against the white tile, the face and shoulders of a stranger, a fierce, bald, very dark Negro, glared at me from the glass. He in no way resembled me. The transformation was total and shocking. I want you to think about this, that this man is shocked by his own visage. It's kind of like the human placebo. Even when we know that the placebo works, even when we know that placebo, the way it works for the human condition, even though we know that a sugar pill will do nothing, but still, half the time it does something. And it's the same idea here. Here he knows the visage in the mirror is himself. The reflection is John Howard Griffin. Yet he himself is shocked, I argue, by his change in his perception, his own racism. So I go on. In the flood of light against the white tile, the face and shoulders of a stranger, a fierce, bald, very dark Negro, glared at me from the glass. He in no way resembled me. The transformation was total and shocking. I had expected to see myself disguised. This was something else. I was imprisoned in the flesh of an utter stranger, an unsympathetic one with whom I felt no kinship. There's that feeling of racism that shocked him. All traces of the John Griffin I had been were wiped from existence. Even the senses underwent a change so profound it filled me with distress. I looked into the mirror and saw nothing of the white John Griffin past. No, the reflections led back to Africa, back to the shanty and the ghetto, back to the fruitless struggles against the mark of blackness. Whew, that was a little rough to read, obviously. Suddenly, almost with no mental preparation, no advance hint, it became clear and permeated my whole being. My inclination was to fight against it. That's that racism I talked about. I had gone too far. I knew now that there is no such thing as a disguised white man. When the black won't rub off. The black man is wholly a Negro, regardless of what he once may have been. I was a newly created Negro who must go out that door and live in a world unfamiliar to me. Now that's uncomfortable to read, but really what you should read from this is he's trying to paint a picture for his white audience, right? And it's commonly asked in scholarly circles, why is this the seminal piece? There are other pieces done. There's even some books written by, people of color who passed for white, right? Different experience, obviously. The argument here is, and it's no different today, a white audience is far more receptive to a white speaker. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. And so here this little turn, right? When he says his inclination was to fight back, and he says there's no such thing as the disguised white man when the black won't rub off. He was a newly created Negro who must go out that door and live in a world unfamiliar to him. So he's unfamiliar living as a Negro. But the black man is wholly a Negro, regardless of what he once may have been. And he talks about when the black won't rub off. So what he's trying to show here is, and again, he's telegraphing what he ends up realizing, because again, he's probably edited this and written it after the fact, likely because he wrote his journal and then he wrote the book after. What he's telegraphing here is the only difference, and like I said earlier, the only difference is the color in the skin, right? Because cringily he'll later talk about how he realized that the sweat of a Negro felt the same as the sweat of a white man. That's weird. That's weird. But what he's trying to get across is this perception that this color of the skin makes them different, right? And that's all he meant by that. I know it's a little tough to hear when he says, he'd gone too far. There was no such thing as this disguised white man when the black won't rub off. It's like I said, the having grown up in this culture that by nature they are required to protect their own thin veil of truth. So if you can't bring yourself to admit something as simple as a human is a human, doesn't matter the color of their skin. I mean, that is tough. That is tough to make someone realize, even for himself. You see that he felt that racism himself. So I argue that he may be writing in such a flowery way, maybe going a little far, to try to get the white audience to step into his shoes, to imagine how their entire identity would melt away from the simple act of darkening one's skin. Right? So I go on. It's black like me. The completeness of this transformation appalled me. It was unlike anything I had imagined. I became two men, the observing one and the one who panicked, who felt negroid even in the depths of his entrails. I felt the beginnings of great loneliness, not because I was a Negro, but because the man I had been, the self I knew, was hidden in the flesh of another. If I returned home to my wife and children, they would not know me. They would open the door and stare blankly at me. My children would want to know, who is this large, bald Negro? If I walked up to friends, I knew I would see no flicker of recognition in their eyes. I had tampered with the mystery of existence, and I had lost the sense of my own being. This is what devastated me. The griffin that was had become invisible. Yeah, that's his own internal bias. The worst of it was that I could feel no companionship with this new person. I did not like the way he looked. Perhaps I thought this was only the shock of a first reaction, but the thing was done, and there was no possibility of turning back. For a few weeks, I must be this aging bald Negro. I must walk through a land hostile to my color, hostile to my skin. How did one start? The night lay out there waiting. 1,000 questions presented themselves. The strangeness of my situation struck me anew. I was a man born old at midnight into a new life. That's a nice one, too. I was a man born old at midnight into a new life. How does such a man act? Where does he go to find food, water, a bed? The phone rang, and I felt my nerves convulse. I answered and told the caller my host was out for the evening. Again, the strangeness, the secret awareness that the person on the other end did not know he talked with a Negro. That's tough. You're not a Negro, bruv. Downstairs, I heard the soft chiming of the old clock. I knew it was midnight, though I did not count. It was time to go. Now, again, I make jokes, but again, I believe he's writing to a white audience to give him an idea. So this person doesn't know he's a Negro. It's again to bring back this idea, this illusion. Kind of like when he said, I was a man born old at midnight into a new life. Well, he was. He was. He's already old. This new identity, it's midnight. He's already kind of mentioned that, right? So it's actually midnight. But what he's talking about is like midlife and all this jazz. Born into a new life, this new, he felt unfamiliar, this idea, metaphor, and actual fact. So again, when he talks about this, that the person on the other end of the phone doesn't know he's a Negro, obviously not, because really the only difference is the color of one's skin. I mean, you say, well, look at Charlie Pride. Charlie Pride had a crazy great country career, particularly because no one knew he was colored, right? So I go on. With enormous self-consciousness, I stepped from the house into the darkness. No one was in sight. I walked to the corner and stood under a street lamp, waiting for the trolley. I heard footsteps from the shadows. The figure of a white man emerged. He came and stood beside me. It was all new. Should I nod, say good evening, or simply ignore him? He stared intently at me. I stood like a statue, wondering if he would speak, would question me. Though the night was cold, sweat dampened my body. This also was new. It was the first time this adult Negro had ever perspired. Okay, again, you're not a Negro. I thought it vaguely illuminating that the Negro Griffins, again, not a Negro, the Negro Griffin's sweat felt exactly the same to his body as the white Griffin's. Again, bruv, it's the same, but he is kind of writing this in a sense to shock and highlight the hypocrisy of believing that a man's skin changes who he is. Because arguably, sweat is sweat, a human is a human. I mean, that's what he's trying to highlight. It is a product of his time, and it's a bit cringy today, but it makes sense if you read it that way. Though the night was cold, sweat dampened my body. He was nervous. He was uncomfortable. He felt out of place. This also was new. The sweating, the uncomfortableness. Usually he felt comfortable in his own skin. This was what was new to him. It was the first time this adult Negro had ever perspired, right? Again, like I said, I think it's twofold to highlight the fact that, hey, he's living as a Negro. It's just by changing his color, he's become a Negro. Again, he's using, an artist. He's using some artistic license here to make this make sense. And again, it's not to be read that, he thought he was a Negro and he thought that a Negro sweat's different. He's trying to speak to his audience who might actually feel that, but more likely, just like the phone, he's trying to highlight the hypocrisy and arguably the what's the word I'm looking for here? just how ridiculous this idea of second class citizenship is because of skin color, right? So he thought it vaguely illuminating that the Negro Griffin's sweat felt exactly the same to his body as the white Griffin's, as I had expected they would be. My discoveries were naive ones, like those of a child. The streetcar, with pale light pouring from its windows, rumbled to a stop. I remembered to let the white man on first. He paid his fare and walked to an empty seat, ignoring me. I felt my first triumph. He had not questioned me. The ticket taker on the streetcar nodded affably when I paid my fare. Though streetcars are not segregated in New Orleans, I took a seat near the back. Negroes there glanced at me without the slightest suspicion or interest. I began to feel more confident. I asked one of them where I could find a good hotel. He said the Butler on Rampart was as good as any, and told me what bus to take from downtown. I got off and began walking along Canal Street, in the heart of town, carrying one small duffel bag in each hand. I passed the same taverns and amusement places where the hawkers had solicited me on previous evenings. They were busy, urging white man to come in and see the girls. The same smell of smoke and liquor and dampness poured out through half-open doors. Tonight they did not solicit. Tonight they did not solicit me. Tonight they looked at me but did not see me. Okay, and what he's talking about is earlier on in the book he talked about when he went down to New Orleans and to do this transformation. He hung out as a white man initially, and he was surprised by, like he mentioned about the hawkers, had solicited him, right? They had bugged him quite a bit. Now walking down the same street as a darkened-skinned white man, Negro, if you will, in this case, pseudo-Negro, he found that they saw right through him. I mean, that thing that we've commonly heard, the refrain we've commonly heard. So we go on. I went into a drugstore that I had patronized. Every day since my arrival, I walked to the cigarette counter where the same girl I had talked with every day waited on me. "Package of Picayunes, please," I said in response to her blank look. She handed them to me, took my bill, and gave me change with no sign of recognition. None of the banter of previous days. Again, my reaction was that of a child. I was aware that the street smells and the drugstore odors of perfume and arnica were exactly the same to the Negro as they had been to the white. Only this time I could not go to the soda fountain and order a limeade or ask for a glass of water. Right? He had actually developed kind of an interesting, fun little banter with the cigarette girl, and what he's highlighting here is all it took was the change in his skin. Remember, the human mind is crazy in this. It takes that implicit bias to see somebody as not human, because the human mind doesn't look at color as a definition, believe it or not. We pick out face shape and eye placement and all that jazz. And we even register, affects, personal affects and stuff, right? Because you can recognize someone walking down the street. So to look at this human being that you had seen possibly every day for a week, I understand in retail, it's not an easy thing, but just imagine what he's trying to highlight here. A simple change in his skin color, tone even. And there was absolutely no recognition. Why? Because these people do not look past the surface, the skin color. If you looked in a man's eyes, are you telling me you would be confused by the simple darkening of one's skin? I don't know. I don't know. That's the question that's intended here. Imagine you as the cigarette counter girl. How would you feel to realize that even you were guilty of that bias, right? So he goes on. He caught the bus to South Rampart Street. Except for the taverns, the streets were deserted when he arrived at the Butler Hotel. A man behind the counter was making a barbecue sandwich for a woman customer. He said he'd find me a room as soon as he finished. I took a seat at one of the tables and waited. A large, pleasant-faced Negro walked in and sat at the counter. He grinned at me and said, "Man, you really got your top shaved, didn't you?" "Yeah. Doesn't it look all right?" Man, it's slick. Makes you look real good, he said. He understands that gals were really going for bald-headed men. They say that's a sure sign of being high-sexed. I let him think I'd shaved my head for that reason. We talked easily. I asked him if this was the best hotel in the area, and he said the sunset down the street might be a little better. I picked up my bags and walked towards the door. "See you around, Slick," he called after me. An orange neon sign guided me to the Sunset Hotel, which is located next to a bar. The drab little lobby was empty. I waited a moment at the desk and then rang a call bell. A man, obviously awakened from sleep, came down the hall in his undershirt buttoning his trousers. He said I would have to pay in advance and that he didn't allow men to take girls up to the rooms. I paid the $2.85 and he led me up the narrow, creaking stairs to the second floor. I stood beside him as he opened the door to my room and saw over his shoulder the desolate, windowless cubicle. I almost backed out, but realized I could probably find nothing better. Bit of a shock, I would agree. So we entered, and I saw that the room was clean. The bathroom's down the hall, he said. I locked the door after him and sat on the bed to a loud twang of springs. A deep gloom spread through me, heightened by a noise of talk, laughter, and jukebox jazz from the bar downstairs. My room was scarcely larger than a double bed. An open transom above the door into the hall provided the only ventilation. The air, mingled with that of other rooms, was not fresh. In addition to the bed, I had a tiny gas stove and a broken-down bedstand. On it were 2 thin hand towels and a half bar of Irish soap. It was past 1 now. The light was so feeble I could hardly see to write. With no windows, I felt boxed in, suffocating. I turned off my light and tried to sleep, but the noise was too much. Light through the open transom fell on the ceiling fan, casting distorted shadows of the 4 motionless blades against the opposite wall. A dog barked nearby, and his bark grew louder as another tune from the jukebox blasted up through the linoleum floor. I could not shake the almost desperate sadness all this evoked, and I marveled that sounds could so degrade the spirit. I slipped into my pants and walked barefoot down the narrow, dim-lit hall to the door with a crudely lettered sign reading "Men." When I stepped in, the hollow roar of water beating against the wall of a metal shower filled the room, along with an odor of cold sweat and soap. One man was in the shower. Another, a large, black-skinned man, sat naked on the floor, waiting his turn at the shower. He leaned back against the wall with his legs stretched out in front of him. Despite his state of undress, he had an air of dignity. Our eyes met, and he nodded his polite greeting. "It's getting cold, isn't it?" he said. "Sure is." "You talking to me?" the man in the shower called out above the thrumming. "No, there's another gentleman in here." "It won't be much longer. Take your time. You don't need the shower." I noted the bathroom was clean, though the fixtures were antique and rust-stained. "Have you got a stove in your room?" the man on the floor asked. We looked at one another, and there was a kindness in his search for conversation. "Yes, but I haven't turned it on." "You didn't want to take a shower, did you?" he asked. No, it's too cold." "You must be freezing on that bare floor with no clothes on." Brown eyes lost some of their gravity. It's been so hot here recently, it feels kind of good to be cold." I stepped over to the corner wash basin to rinse my hands. "Oh, you can't use that," he said quickly. That water will run out on the floor." I looked beneath, as he indicated, and saw it had no drain pipe. He reached beside him, and flicked back the wet canvas shower curtain. "Hey, how about stepping back and letting this gentleman wash his hands?" "That's all right, I can wait," I said. "Go ahead," he nodded. Sure, come on," the man in the shower said. He turned the water down to a dribble. In the shower's obscurity, all I could see was a black shadow and gleaming white teeth. I stepped over the other's outstretched legs and washed quickly. Using the soap the man in the shower thrust into my hands. When I had finished, I thanked him. "That's all right. Glad to do it," he said, turning the water on full strength again. The man on the floor handed up his towel for me to dry my hands. Under the dim light in the tiny room without windows, I realized I was having my first prolonged contact as a Negro with other Negroes. Not a Negro, bruv. Its drama lay in its lack of drama, in its quietness, in the courtesies we felt impelled to extend to one another. I wondered if the world outside was so bad for us that we had to counter it among ourselves by salving one another with kindness. I love that. When I read it first with the wife out loud just today, just to remind me of this, because I remembered his first encounter. Remembered his last visit with the doctor too, warning him that it wouldn't come to. Hey, he was not looking forward to being responsible for what might happen here. So I just love that, like these kindnesses that are shared amongst the downtrodden, amongst the disenfranchised. Right? It's a beautiful thing. So he goes on. You want a cigarette? I asked. Please, sir, I believe I will, answered the black man on the floor. He leaned his heavy body forward to accept one. His black flesh picked up dull highlights from the bare globe overhead. I finished my pants pocket. I fished in my pants pocket for matches and lighted our cigarettes. We talked of local politics. I told him I was new in town and knew nothing about him. He refrained from asking questions, but explained that Mayor Morrison had a good reputation for fairness, and the Negroes were hoping he would be elected governor. There you go. This is in the 50s, and I love to say that even today, the black community aren't active, politically active in the sense of local and thinking about this sort of stuff. But I may be wrong there too. Maybe getting the wrong information. But again, arguably, I'm speaking about everyone. None of us are as active in politics as we should be, or informed as we should. It's an obligation, they say, as a citizen to be an informed voter. And in this case, just simple conversation, and they're talking about local politics, state politics. Right? So he goes on. He sensed the conversation made little difference, that for a few moments we were safe from the world, and we were loath to break the communication and go back to our rooms. It gave us warmth and pleasure. Though we talked formally and showed one another great respect, not once did he ask my name or where I came from. When the man in the shower finished and stepped out dripping, the large man hoisted himself up from the floor, tossed his cigarette in the toilet bowl, and got into the shower. I told him good night and returned to my room, less lonely, warmed by the brief contact with others like me, who felt the need to be reassured that an eye could show something besides suspicion or hate. So there's another line that shows that he's written this after his experience, because he hasn't experienced any suspicion or hate. Interesting, in the book, he didn't experience it for, I think, about a week. He actually was like, hey, New Orleans ain't that bad for the black folk. Okay, so I made a mistake. I think I'm not sure if I read on to the November 8th, but here, we'll just stop here at November 7th. November 7th. Again, that was John Howard Griffin, Black Like Me. My apologies. I'm more or less just testing out the live streaming and using OBS for live streaming and then recording segments as I live stream. Probably should have done that on Twitch because I could have tested both, but here we are testing YouTube because it seems to be a bit of a manure show. But here we are.